Recovering possibilities for language renaissance is our topic today. Some of the background, the things we've been talking about already. Communities are looking for programs, and it's your job as leaders to help facilitate that. Look at places like what the Maori are doing in New Zealand, the Hawaii people in Hawaii with their punana leos. In Quebec, we've had a Mohawk immersion program for 30 years, and in Ontario. Remember, there's not one size fits all. Each community is different, and your program will need to be tailored for your community. This is a fairly new field, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the places we look for ideas is the area of second language acquisition and second language teaching. We'll talk a little bit about that today, and take what we can find in other places and apply them here. Think about what you already do in English language, good English language arts classrooms, and what of those practices and materials can you use in a Cree or Dene classroom? Now, materials that don't necessarily have words on them, but images and wordless picture books. And don't forget, in overall, we need to think about both oral language and literacy, because if immersion programs are going to work, or any good second language programs are going to work, children are going to need to learn how to read and write in those languages as well. Some of the second language researchers that we look to are people like Stephen Crashton and his theories around how we acquire languages and how we learn languages. Teachers need to make the language input, as Crashton would say, we need to make the language input comprehensible, so it's at their level. It's not too far above them, it's not too abstract. So using as many real things as possible, including gestures and pictures and hands-on kind of artifacts. Another one of Crashton's main points is the environment needs to be very well supported, and children need to feel like they can take the risks to try new things in the language. No one's going to laugh at them. And he calls this the affective filter, that we need to lower the affective filter and make sure there's no shame or worry, intimidation around doing it right. James Cummins is a Canadian researcher who has established worldwide acclaim for his work, research work in immersion programming. And he talks about what's abbreviated to be BICS and KELP. And I'm going to come back to these in a minute, and how important both of these are to good immersion, good language teaching. I will just come back to it in a minute. Another thing James Cummins has reminded us is the benefits of bilingualism. And not just teachers, but parents as well need to understand these kinds of things. Cummins says that we're blessed with bilingual brains. Our brains are capable of learning more than one language. And when people learn two languages, they acquire cognitive benefits, that their thinking is stronger and more flexible in two languages than one. So that we're giving children this extra cognitive potential by teaching them in two languages. Here's his term BICS, Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. And that's the kind of language you use when you're meeting someone and you're greeting them. You're wanting to ask where the bathroom is. You want to know how to get to the post office. Those kinds of things. Getting along. And those are the kinds of things children learn very quickly. The oral language, personal kinds of things. They can learn that quite quickly. But if we don't pay attention to KELP, cognitive academic language proficiency, they won't be successful academically with their new language. So that's the academic language required for studying in the language. So to learn science, to learn math, to learn social studies, to learn geography, we need this higher level of language use. So as teachers, it's good to start with the BICS and the basic kinds of things, but we can't stop there. And we need to be into this more cognitive academic use of language by grades 3 and on. Or they'll never develop full fluency and or literacy. We're going to talk a little bit about different kinds of programs, so that you can think about what kind of programming is going on already in your schools and what the possibilities are for others. And first and foremost in all of this is that any kind of program, all programs, need to be making the connection between language and culture. And that needs to be honored and lived out in very real ways in the classroom. I'm going to talk a little bit in the next few slides about these kinds of programs, core language programs, and that's what we have for the most part in Western Canada. Indigenous language immersion programs that you're all familiar, these are starting in a handful of places. And some other kinds of bilingual language programs, transitional bilingual programs, maintenance bilingual programs, and dual language programs. And we'll come back to this in these slides. So a core language is what is common in most provincial schools and band control schools, where the language is taught as a subject. Children get a class in the language maybe every day if they're lucky for 30 minutes, 40 minutes. But it's not the whole day. It's not even a full half a day. It's just a very short time period. There's very little research that there has been ever any success and that anyone has ever become bilingual through a core language program. There's just not enough time. It takes a huge number of hours to acquire a language, and you just can't get enough of it in 15 and 20 minutes a day. Very few speakers are ever produced. I did hear the example of a little program in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was a high school program, and it was a core language program. But it was very student-based, and it was very immersion. They were using immersion teaching practices, even though it was only an hour a day. And they used a lot of audiovisual and audio recordings of elders and audio recordings of conversations, and the students audio recorded themselves, and they went and audio recorded their parents or their grandparents, and they used those in class. So we need to keep looking for some success with, if the only amount of time we have is 1 hour a day or 40 minutes a day, then we need to use it as best as possible. If you're actually having success with your program, and I do know we have teachers who have some success, we need to get it written about and hear about it. Immersion programs. French immersion programs have led the way internationally in what's being done, even in Indigenous language contexts. The Maori people picked up from our French immersion and started their language nests, and they have full programs now that go all the way from preschool to university immersed in Maori. They follow the key principles of second language learning that we're talking about. They're very community based, and all subjects are taught in Maori. In Hawaii, they have similar programs. There's a small program in interior BC that's been in existence for probably about 10 years, and I mentioned earlier, the Mohawk programs. And we have even closer to home a few, like Onion Lake First Nations immersion program currently has over 200 children in a K-5. There's also a small bilingual program in Clearwater River in northern Saskatchewan that is a Dene dual language program, about half the day in Dene and half the day in English, and they're having some good success. There are also successful immersion programs in Nunavut and even in communities where children come to school speaking their language as their first language. Other kinds of bilingual programs, sorry, I don't want to make sure I missed a slide here, sorry, I'm coming back. A transition program is what we saw in the early days, where the indigenous language was only used kind of as a support, of a learning support for children while they learned English. We had one of these that was relatively well documented in northern Manitoba in the early 70s, but it phased out as the language was lost in the community and the children no longer came to school as first language Cree speakers. There are other kinds of bilingual programs that are called maintenance programs. And again, maintenance meaning maintain the language the child already has. So these are programs where children come to school speaking a fair degree of their language. And I think this could be said for Clearwater River in northern Saskatchewan, because more than half of those children are coming to school speaking Dene as their first language. So that half-day program they have, bilingual program they have, is a maintenance program. It's maintaining and strengthening the Dene language and teaching English at the same time. The Halapai program in Arizona is an example of that, and they talk about 3 major points for success. And one was the community support, a second was the teacher development, the PD that went along the whole time, and the third was their use of current technologies and digital technologies. There's a reference here at the bottom to the Clearwater River, and maybe in one of our classes someone with some experience with that can elaborate that a little bit more. So dual language programs or partial immersion programs. So programs that have been successful need to have at least 50% of their time in the Indigenous language. So in New Zealand, as well as having Māori immersion programs, they have a lot of bilingual programs throughout the country. And those programs, and I have visited those programs, are very rich in literacy development as well. They're not just about oral language. They're doing all the things in Māori with storybooks and children's literature and science books that they are doing in English as well. We have a few of these bilingual programs emerging in cities such as Saskatoon. Sorry, I just heard some noise in the background here. Sorry. But we don't see anything written about them yet, so we need to know more about them. I've mentioned this before. We need to keep looking for good second language teaching practices. What is going on? One instructional focus is called communication-based language instruction, CBI. Now, CBI would be considered a method of how to teach. And it concentrates on communication, active communication, hence communicative language-based. Meaningful communication. Children have to use the language, and they start with more practical things they need to do in the language, and they move to more academically challenging things they need to do in the language. In a CBI approach, as a teacher, you need to set the scene. You need to make sure that the input you're providing to the children is at a level they can understand. You guide them in their learning. You give them some guided learning and then some independent practice where they can try things out in pairs. You bring in stories, have illustrations with them, and those kinds of intensive language teaching practices. In a CBI, you introduce literacy in a supportive way with shared reading, read-alouds, and use good experiential literacy texts and authentic literacy, literature. Excuse me, I just need a little drink of water here. In this kind of teacher practice, teacher reads things like picture storybooks. You could write a language experience story, take the children out on an excursion, come back to the classroom, write about it in Crier Dene, have them reread that over with you, label the things around you and in their world in Crier Dene, and do not just Crier Dene in your Indigenous language, because I know we have speakers of other languages here, sorry, and have them do journal writing. Just as we would in an English language classroom. They'll do a little bit of text and an illustration to go with it. As they acquire more oral language, they can take on more complex tasks. The time to acquire a second language, as I said a few minutes ago, is huge. So use every minute you have. Don't give your time away to English. Stay in your language. Avoid code switching if at all possible. So, lots of good oral language development opportunities, using immersion methods, and following up by good literacy experiences. TPR, you're probably familiar with TPR, and TPR is very, very helpful in early stages. And so is Dr. Stephen Gray Morning's Accelerated Second Language Acquisition Methods. And some of you may have taken part in his workshops, and I hope you did, and use. And again, these are very successful for the early stages of learning a language. And they only work so far. And Stephen wouldn't want me to say that, but I've heard teachers say that, how useful they are. But after a few years, you need to move on. Songs and music are a great way to provide lots of oral repetition. The language comes across in a nice rhythmic way, and kids enjoy, and kids like it. And they don't mind repeating and singing the song over and over. Role-playing and creative theater are another way because part of the piece of the puzzle here is capturing kids' interest and keeping them interested. So we've got to mix up the methodologies and keep it happening, and try some creative theater. All activities and routines from your classroom are repeated over and over. You need to hear something orally 10, 20 times before you capture it in your memory. Don't forget about literacy. Use wordless picture books, do read-alouds, do shared readings, teach teaching strategies. Reading in an Indigenous language is a process just like reading in English, where we pause, we stop, we go back, we reread, we have strategies, we predict what do we think might come next, what do we know about what's going on. Use all of those reading strategies with your own language. Write language experience stories, as I mentioned on the last slide, and have them writing and illustrating their own stories. Assessment is an area we often overlook, and it's very important, and if we're going to be successful at this, we really need to turn our heads and thoughts towards assessment and thinking about the purposes of assessment. So there's some kinds of assessment we need to do right off the start, like how much language do these kids already have? So you need to figure that out for the children in your classroom. You need to teach your teachers how to do that. We can't just assume they all have none, and we can't assume they all have some. So looking at, listening, asking them things, asking them in their language to do things for you. If they can do them, then they're understanding. So we also need to think then about more ongoing classroom assessments. So are they getting what we're teaching them? Are they performing? Can they do these things? Can they do the thinking in their language? And how much actual language are they learning? Are they learning some new vocabulary? How can we assess for that? Are they learning more about their grammar? What are they mastering? What do we still need to support them in their instructions? So this citation at the bottom is Francis and Rayner, who've done a lot of work in Arizona with Indigenous languages and in some assessments. So I would encourage you to look those up. Now, John Rayner, who you may or may not have heard of, has published so many great compilations of articles from classroom teachers, the Stabilizing Indigenous Languages sets. So we'll be bringing those to class, and I encourage you to use those. I came across an interesting example at a conference of what they were doing in a Cherokee preschool immersion program. And of course, so these children are 2 to 5 year olds, and they were assessing using these 4 tools. This is also written up in the ILA handbook, which you'll have a look at in class. So the first thing they did, and this is after the children have been in the preschool immersion for X amount of time, they do, and perhaps they do this 2 or 3 times a year, they do an interview with the child where they're asking him to respond, like, hello, how are you? Simple questions about themselves. What's your name? What's your mother's name? And seeing if the children comprehend that. A section where the children match pictures with the word that the teacher says. So they hold up a picture, say what it is, and ask the children to respond to what the picture is asking them to do. And they've also just heard it, so they're getting it in 2 ways, through the visual mode of seeing the picture and the oral mode of you asking them. And a production component where the children are asked to provide names of items. Then again, that could be from pictures. What is this? What is this? And a simple no answer to simple questions. So if the child understands the question, they know enough to answer whether it's a yes or a no. These all are telling you things about what they're comprehending. And a storytelling section. This is the more complex one. Remember, these are 2 to 5 year olds. So the child is asked to tell a simple story in Cherokee. And the teacher listens to that story to see how the child is actually using their language. You're going to have to look for resources and share resources. Look around you. Look at the Gift of Language resources, the Dene Kade curriculum, your own provincial curriculums, and use what is useful to you. Professional development and teacher training is central to all of this. and it's your job as leaders to help plan, figure out what your teachers need and help plan for that. So teachers are the key. It doesn't matter how many books we have. It doesn't matter how many computers we have. If our teachers aren't up on in terms of what good teaching is, and aren't making their classrooms exciting places and the language accessible, it's not going to work. Being a speaker is not enough. There's a lot of complexities in second language teaching. And teachers need the background knowledge about how we acquire language and how we can then teach language, both oral language and literacy. I am a bit biased, but our Indigenous language education courses here at CILDI are the closest and most accessible summer course offerings for teachers and teacher assistants in Western Canada. We're slowly expanding to do some during the year offerings, and we're hoping that you will join us and bring your teachers along in that. Find ways to support your teachers. We talked earlier about program planning and the development and implementation and evaluation of the best program for your context, whether it be core language teaching, immersion language teaching, or some form of bilingual language teaching. As your school develops their plan, you need to prioritize what kind of PD do the teachers need. Ask your teachers, map it out over the year and for the next year. Build digital expertise amongst your teachers and teaching assistants. Establish networks amongst them. Organize school-based language teams based on grade level. So some grade 2 teachers working together. English teachers, Indigenous language teachers, teacher assistants, any consultants you might have, and do some co-planning and look back over the year and do some assessment together. Coordinate regional or language-specific efforts to support your teachers. So in every community, you're going to need to think about what kind of program is most appropriate for your community and plan for the maximum language learning. Maybe start with Head Starts, nurseries, fully immersion. Build them up each year. Add a little bit more Indigenous language. Establish a language planning committee in your community that meets on a regular basis and includes elders and parents and community members, teachers, schools administrators. Pull everyone in to this. Develop a plan for your school, short-term, long-term. Support language program initiatives that are on-site and off-site. Maybe there are things going on in your community that you need to tag into. Look for funding. Establish an overall budget. Think about what is it going to cost us to do it at a minimal level and what would our really biggest wish list include. Continue to document. What successes are you having? Tape record those children. Get that language down. Who are the other people in your community who can help you? Get their language down. Support all that are interested and willing to help. Continue to do your own research. Look at what's going on and who else is writing about it. Write about the work you're doing in your community. I have a place for you to publish it. It's the FEL newsletter. I'll take any and all short articles about what you're doing in your school and in your community. Use the social media. Make social media your friend. So ensure that CBI is going on in every Indigenous language classroom. Doesn't matter, as I said earlier, whether it's core language or immersion. Teach your teachers and teaching assistants how to use immersion. We can't just assume anyone knows. There's something very natural about immersion practices, but it takes work. It takes a lot of energy to stay immersed and build the immersion practices. Encourage teachers to work together. Excuse me, I need another drink of water here. Encourage other members on your staff. I've been in schools where some of the richest repositories of the Indigenous language was amongst the support staff, the janitors, the secretaries. Include them in your program. Have the kids have a policy where when the kids speak to the janitor and the janitor speaks to the kids, it needs to be in your language. If they're a resource to you, utilize them. Expect the children to speak. Now, we really have to up our expectations for children. And we know there's a silent period at the beginning when anyone is learning a second language, that while you're processing it, and it takes time, and we don't want to put a lot of pressure on them right off the start. But don't wait too long, or they'll start to think that you don't expect them to speak back to you. So organize activities where they have to speak in the language to get something done, to get their request met, to communicate something to someone else, and give them opportunities to learn not only their language, but ideas through their language. So we're teaching the language, teaching through the language. So they're learning about themselves, about their community, about their world in the Indigenous language. This is a bit repetitive. Sharing resources, using provincial curriculums, providing leadership, compiling resources. There's some suggestions in the Green Book of Language Revitalization. If you don't currently have a copy of the Green Book of Language Revitalization, you need to get one. We'll bring one to class. There's just hundreds of great ideas, and also the Indigenous Language Institute in New Mexico's set of 10 handbooks on what to do in immersion and Indigenous language teaching. Develop an outreach component where you pull in your community members. Find your elders. How is the best way to incorporate an elder into your classrooms? Collaborate with the elders and get their ideas about what needs to be done. So, in closing, these are some of your jobs as leaders. So I want you to think and write about this in your journal. As leaders, it is very important that we are as informed as we possibly can be about our field. We need to be able to articulate. We need to be able to explain to others why these things matter and what is going on in other places and what has been tried and what are some kinds of programs and what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks and how we might make our choices based on these kinds of things. So all of the work you've been doing in these prior units are building your knowledge base about Indigenous languages worldwide and locally. And as we go on in this course, we're going to be talking more about leadership and leadership models, but a good leader needs to be solidly based, both feet grounded solidly in the field that you want to lead. So bring all of this with you in your learning journey and bring all you've learned so far. Let's write about it a little bit and think about how you're going to bring this to your community. Then again.